Iceland has very strong links with Scandinavian countries. Its language, Icelandic, is a North Germanic language related to the other Scandinavian languages, and its flag is a lot like the other Scandinavian flags. But where does this connection with Scandinavia come from? Well, in this video, we're going to find out. Now, if you didn't know, the answer is the Vikings, of course, or the Norwegians more specifically. And actually the reason why I'm making this video is because another channel called Shadiversity was kind enough to give this channel, History with Hilbert, a shout out yesterday in one of his videos, something for which I am very grateful. And if you haven't already subscribed and checked out Shad's channel, then please do go and do that. He makes very interesting commentaries like the ones that I do, but also with different styles, looking at historical armor and weapons, a lot of things about the Middle Ages, and he specifically mentioned that I made a few videos about the Vikings, which is true, I do that, and quite a few people have come in, something I'm very thankful to Shad for, because he's obviously helping a lot of other smaller channels, not just mine, to grow with this. So I thought to welcome all the new people on board, I would kick us off with a video about the Vikings, or the Norsemen more specifically, and their interaction with Iceland, the discovery of Iceland. So that's what the video is going to be about. Now, before we kick off, I would like to say that actually it's very likely that the first people on Iceland were not actually Scandinavians, but were Gaelic, so probably Irish, monks. However, they actually decided to leave as soon as the Norsemen arrived because they didn't really get on too well. But it'd be interesting to see how and when they actually got there, so I might make another video about that at some point in the future. So to begin with, it was mostly, as I mentioned, the Norsemen, so people from Norway, although this wasn't actually a kingdom when the first people started going to Iceland. And it's important to look a bit at the other geography and where Norwegians were before they got to Iceland, because they didn't just cross the sea straight from Norway to Iceland. They actually first colonised in the middle of the 9th century the Faroe Islands, as well as having colonies and taking over parts of the Hebrides, northern Scotland, Shetland and Orkney, as well as establishing a few beachheads in Ireland, most famously of course Dublin, which is today the capital of Ireland. And the first explorer that we're going to look at, or actually is an accidental explorer, is a man named Naddodd. And Naddodd was himself a Norseman from somewhere in West Norway, and while he was en route to the Faroe Islands where he actually lived, he drifted off course and ended up in Iceland. Now, Naddodd is an interesting character, and with all of these people who I'm going to mention, we have no idea the exact dates of when they were born, because interestingly enough, these guys were variously unknown actually. They weren't the big cheeses, so no one was really writing about them. They became famous because they discovered these places, which makes them interesting because we don't really hear too much about quote-unquote common people from the Dark Ages. But he then lands in Iceland. He was actually one of the first settlers on the Faroe Islands, and he became the first Scandinavian, at least to our knowledge, who landed in Iceland. Now, when he got there, he did climb a hill to look for signs of life, but he couldn't find any signs of any smoke or anything, so he decided it would be uninhabited. And when he went back to his ship, it started to snow. So because it started to snow, he decided to call this new land Snaland, which is Old Norse for snowland, and that was the first name of Iceland. He then went home again, and we never hear about him again. Now, the second person I'd like to look at in relation to Iceland is a man named Garðar Svarfarsson. And Garðar Svarfarsson was born sometime around the same period as the previous explorer, as Naddodd. And very interestingly, he was Swedish. Now, I've hardly talked about the Swedes because I haven't yet covered the East, because the Swedes very famously went to the East rather than the West. They sailed down the rivers of the Ukraine, such as the Dnieper, and also the rivers of Russia to get to the Baltic, the area around Byzantium at the time, to trade with the Byzantines and to raid that way, as well as establishing the country that would become obviously Russia, which is named after them. They were called the Rus. But the reason why this guy is going west is because he held lands in Denmark. Now, Garðar was married to a woman from the Hebrides, and while he was travelling to the Hebrides to claim an inheritance, he was in the Pentland Firth, a very hard piece of water to navigate, which is essentially between, I believe, Orkney and the north coast of Scotland, and he drifted ashore again, went way to the north, and ended up coming again to Iceland. So you see, the second time it's also a mistake. And he arrives in Iceland, and instead of making landfall, he and his crew actually are the first ones to circumnavigate Iceland, and therefore to prove that it was indeed an island, because obviously Garðar had no idea that it wasn't an island. And they actually made winter camp at a place called Húsavík, and Húsavík is the Old Norse for house bay, so Húsavík. Vík is also a possible route for where we get the word Víkingur from, which is this word that developed into Viking. And they stayed there over the winter, and when finally the spring came again, they decided to head off. But that actually isn't the end of the story, as while he was going off, one of his slaves, or actually 3 of them, managed to escape, and this slave was called Nattfari. And we don't actually know what happened to them, although they did make it ashore on Iceland, and they would be the first settlers then who remained for a while longer, although we're not sure what happened to them later, if they managed to survive, or if they perished or then managed to escape back to the known world, quote unquote. So the next one that we're going to look at, you will probably have heard of, and he is actually the character that Flóki in the Vikings is based off. And this guy is called Hrafna-Flóki Vilgarðarsson, and he was born again a similar period to this, and he was actually the first person to purposefully go to Iceland. He'd obviously heard the stories of Naddodd and Garðar, who had gone to Iceland by accident, and he was the first one to go there on purpose. So he went first to the Scottish Islands, to Shetland, where unfortunately his daughter drowned, and then back onto the Faroe Islands, where he acquired 3 ravens. And this is where he gets his nickname from, Hrafna. Hrafna is the Old Norse for raven, so he's called Hrafna-Flóki, because he sets these ravens off. That was an old technique used by Norse and Scandinavian travellers at the time, seafarers, was to find land that ravens could, obviously they could see way above what a human could see because they could fly, so they would essentially fly to the nearest piece of land. And he set one off and it flew back to the Faroe Islands. He then later on set another one off and it flew around for a bit and landed back on the mast, but the 3rd raven he set off went straight in a northwesterly direction, and then he knew that the northwesterly direction, that must be where Iceland was, and he was bang on the money. And he then landed at a place called Vatnsfjörður, which I believe is something like Fjord of the Lakes, something along those lines. Also, I've tried, actually I haven't done it on this one, but I've tried to make the place names the Old Norse versions of the place names, although in this one I've forgotten to do that, because difference between Old Norse and Icelandic place names a lot of the time is the Old Norse would just end in the R, whereas the Icelandic, the modern Icelandic, they put a U in front of it. So instead of Vatnsfjörður, it'd be Vjarnasfjörður. So, yeah, I just thought I'd mention that. And he and his family, they all went to Iceland and they stayed in Vatnsfjörður for some years, although they had quite a hard time. But actually, while Flóki was down by the river, he climbed a mountain again and he sees an iceberg. So he decided to call the land Iceland, or he didn't really see an iceberg, he saw a massive glacier. And then he thought, oh, it's the land of ice, so I'll call it Iceland. And this is actually the name that stuck. Although he had a very hard time finding food on Iceland, although they did manage to survive, and actually after a while they did return back to Norway. Although he did actually come back to Iceland with his family, and that's where he died, even though he said that the land wasn't worth coming back to. So he contradicted himself in the end, and perhaps he might have only said that Iceland wasn't worth settling because he didn't want other people to settle it. Now, the next person I'd like to look at is a man called Ingólfur, and I've forgotten to do it again on that one, apologies, Ingólfur Arnarsson. And he is a very interesting one because he also purposefully sailed to Iceland, the reason being that he was involved in a blood feud in Norway, which meant he was excluded. And actually this is very interesting because a lot of the Norsemen who went west, so I believe in the case of Eric the Red as well, he went west from Iceland to Greenland because he had been involved in feuding in Iceland. So you can almost see it as the Wild West of the Dark Ages. A lot of these guys were the brigands, the shadowy figures who were looking to escape a troubled past by going west to first the Faroe Islands or the Scottish Isles, and then obviously Iceland, and after that you have obviously the trek west again across the Denmark Strait to Greenland, and finally the Americas, which is where Leif Erikson ended up, but I'll make videos about that in the future. So he sets off to Iceland, and he finds Iceland as well, and he has his slaves or his thralls, many of which were from Ireland. So you have a lot of Irish DNA, especially in the females in Iceland, because of they had a lot of female Irish slaves, or at least that was a theory for quite a while. And he had these slaves throw over his post holes, and these post holes were for his seat in the Great Hall. You'd have these great big posts that you would take with you, and he threw them overboard and then sailed off, and he said, wherever these post holes end up, that is where I will build my house or my farmstead on this new land. And where did they find them? Nowhere other than the place we now call Reykjavik, which is the capital of Iceland today. And Reykjavik is also the Vik ending, so the bay or the cove, and it's the Cove of Smoke. That's the rough translation, probably because of the, I imagine, the geysers or volcanoes in the area, things like that with the steam, because obviously Iceland is very geologically an interesting place. So they set up camp in Reykjavik. But there is trouble, as his half-brother who came with him, who was called Hjolfir, he is killed by his Irish slaves. Now, he goes after the Irish slaves, obviously, that have killed his brother, and he chases them right the way down to the Westman Islands, or the Vestmannaeyjar, in Icelandic. And there he catches up to the slaves and kills them all. It's actually very interesting, because a lot of places en route to where he killed one slave and drowned another and then caught the last ones, they are all named after the places where these slaves were slaughtered by Ingólfur. And then obviously he returns to Reykjavik, and soon Reykjavik became a very popular place for people to go, especially in the middle of the 9th and the 10th century, when successive rulers were starting to take over power, consolidate power in the kingdoms of Norway. So for example with Harald Harfager, Harold Fairhair, and people started to go to Iceland to escape these, and obviously Reykjavik became an important place. And actually by the end of the 9th century, you actually have that pretty much all the land in Iceland was taken at that point. So it went really quite quickly as soon as these first sort of beachheads in Iceland had been established. So thank you very much for watching. I hope I've not rambled on too much, but this has been my video about the Norse discovery of Iceland. Now, I hope you have indeed enjoyed this quick video that I've put up, and welcome to the channel everyone. Again, massive thank you to Shadiversity for the shout out, and massive welcome to everyone who has come over to the channel from that shout out, and anyone else who hasn't come from the shout out but is just here, then thank you very much for watching. So yeah, I'm History with Hill, but if you have anything to add or any comments, anything else you'd like to know, then don't hesitate to leave a comment in the comment section below, and I will be happy to answer them when I get the time to. Now, I might make a few more videos about Viking Iceland. I find it a very interesting topic, as well as perhaps the Age of Settlement, or the settlement of Greenland, and then the Americas as well. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, a comment, and to subscribe. I'm History with Hilbert, and I will see you soon.